o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're watching it after the live broadcast, if you want to post a question, we'll review them later and get back to you. Today, I am very excited to have with me Katherine Eban, who has put together an amazing book, incredibly well about the generic drug pool, I'm going to call it, in America. Katherine, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today.
I am so excited to share this information with our audience. And later in the broadcast, we were going to see and hear from Dr. Harry Weber, dear friend from the Cleveland Clinic, and one of our HCM warriors, Kristine Jones from Connecticut, who can share her own personal experience. I'm going to set this up a little bit with a story on personal experience. I have two. One I'll tell at the beginning and one I'll tell at the end. Back in 1996, I took a family vacation. And on my way out to vacation, I had to refill a prescription of a drug, a beta blocker, and I had been taking CoreGuard, name brand. When I got to Cape Cod, I opened the pill bottle and realized they looked different. And I called my pharmacist and I said, "This isn't my pill." He said, "Oh, your PBM has chosen this manufacturer. It's what you're going to get from now on. It's the same thing, don't worry." I said, "Okay, great." I took the pill and my heart rate was no longer regulated. I had a heart rate of about 105, 110 beats a minute for a day. And I thought, well, maybe it's a fluke. I'm traveling, whatever. Day two, same thing. Day three, I said, there's something wrong with these pills. I called my pharmacist and I said, I want my brand name back. And I need to send them up to me on vacation because I'm not going to spend my vacation like this. And I ended up having to pay out of pocket for it. Got my pill. And on day 5 of my vacation, my heart rate went back to 65. I never took that generic drug again. What was going on behind the scenes that I didn't know?
So at this point, I've heard, unfortunately, so many similar stories. And it was actually stories like that that led me down the road to investigate what became Bottle of Lies, the book that I published in May. It was in 2008 when I got a phone call from Joe Graydon, who's a radio show host on NPR. He has a show called The People's Pharmacy. And he said to me, he knew I was an investigative journalist. I'd reported in the area of pharmaceuticals. And he said, I am getting flooded with complaints from patients who say that they're having, complications, side effects, or medical setbacks because of their generic drugs. And I began to investigate, what I didn't know at that time. I mean, I'd set out to interview patients and interview doctors and look at the FDA's standards for approving generic drugs, which are actually more porous than you'd think. And we can talk about that. But my reporting ultimately led me to a very big story of corporate corruption in the manufacturing plants that are making the majority of America's generic drugs. And those
I'm going to pause you for a second and ask you to try your headsets again because we are getting some feedback.
Okay, sure. Just a moment.
Don't want to break your stride there, but I don't want anybody to miss any of this.
That's okay. Hold on.
So while we're getting her set up, I know people are still joining us, and this is the book we're talking about today, Bottle of Lies, and we are going to be discussing in detail why generic drug manufacturing is something we need to really pay attention to in the United States.
Hi there. Is that better?
It's still giving me a little feedback, but I'm going to turn my volume down. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. So what I didn't realize is that the complaints from American patients was going to lead me 7,000 miles away to India and ultimately to China, where the majority of our generic drugs are made. And what I uncovered was endemic fraud in those manufacturing plants that are altering their quality data in their laboratories in order to get approval from regulators to market their generic drugs. So in fact, the complaints from patients were due to something very real, which is that Americans are getting generic drugs that in some cases are not bioequivalent, may contain metallic fragments, glass particles, impurity spikes. And in fact, the FDA is really struggling to regulate these overseas plants properly.
I muted myself so we didn't have feedback. Something happens in India with a gentleman named Dinesh Thakur
Mhm.
that blows this whole thing
Yeah,
just open.
yeah.
And the book to me is truly a page turner mystery as you're going through it.
Mm.
But can you give us some ideas on how this started to crack open and
Yeah,
how we were able to start seeing inside what the problems were?
yeah. So Dinesh Thakur who's the main character in the book, and he was a young engineer at Bristol Myers Squibb, and he was recruited by a company called Ranbaxy, India's largest drug company at the time. So this was back in about 2004, 2003. Um, Recruited to help manage the company's global supply chain, basically. And he got there, and not that long after he arrived, and there were all kinds of sort of red flags and warning signs, but he got a new boss as head of research and development. That fellow suspected that something was not right with the company's data, and he asked Dinesh to investigate the company's regulatory filings to see if the data in the filings was real or fake. So Dinesh and his team dove into these filings and uncovered sort of the dark secret of the company, which is that they had falsified quality data for over 200 products in more than 40 countries.
Okay, wait. So falsified data means what to the person that's opening the bottle of drugs?
Right. So when a generic company applies to the FDA to sell their drugs into the US, the way that the FDA figures out whether they're going to approve those drugs, and this is kind of shocking, they don't figure it out just by testing the drugs, and they don't really test the drugs. They figure it out by reviewing the company's data. So the company is filing laboratory data with regulators to show that the drug is bioequivalent and that it doesn't have impurity spikes and that it doesn't dissolve improperly. But Ranbaxy was faking that data, so much so that they were actually testing brand name drugs in lieu of their own drugs and submitting that data to regulators to show that their drugs were bioequivalent. So that's what Dinesh Thakur uncovered. But when his boss, Dr. Raj Kumar, submitted Dinesh's findings to the board of directors, they opted for a cover-up. They asked for the report to be destroyed, for the computer on which it was created to be destroyed. Dinesh was forced out of the company, and he ended up becoming a whistleblower. He took his documents and his information to the FDA, which launched an 8-year investigation into Ranbaxy. And
8 years.
8 years. And, mind you, at the end of this, Ranbaxy pled guilty to 7 felonies for faking data. But in the interim, the FDA, knowing full well that this company had committed a massive fraud, continued to approve its applications, to the extent that it gave Ranbaxy permission to launch the biggest generic drug launch in history, which was generic Lipitor. And I don't know if any of the listeners joining us today felt delighted when Lipitor went generic in 2011, but if you were taking that drug, you were taking a Ranbaxy generic, and it turned out that Lipitor was suffused with glass particles, and it all had to be recalled.
Glass particles.
Mhm.
Where did the glass particles get into medication?
Those are the kind of things that are happening in these overseas manufacturing plants. Now, a compliant plant, things go wrong all the time, but in a compliant plant, part of good manufacturing practices is that a plant investigates itself. It reports any anomalies and it pulls any low quality drugs off the market. It destroys them, doesn't sell them. But that's not what's happening in some of these plants. They are, instead of responsibly investigating themselves and pulling back the drugs and reporting problems to the FDA, they're falsifying the data instead as a way to gain approval from regulators.
Okay, so as a patient,
Mhm,
or I guess most of us are patients, and you're getting your prescription filled,
mhm.
and it's an FDA approved drug, and it's been sold to you at your local pharmacy or mailed to you by your mail-in pharmacy. Some people might think that the FDA can just pop in, and the whole time that generic drugs have been legal, pop in and inspect a facility.
Mhm.
Is that how it happens?
Well, the way it's supposed to happen is that FDA investigators arrive unannounced at a plant roughly every 2 years. They'll show up unannounced and make sure that the plant is following the rules. And that is really how it happens in the US. But overseas, the FDA has made a very different decision. Um, because of all the complications with logistics, they give plants months of advance notice that they're coming. They ask for the plant's help arranging ground transportation and hotels. So the dynamic is that the investigators who arrive become um, essentially the guests of the manufacturing plants, and the manufacturing plants are the hosts. And what ends up happening is the plants prepare for those visits, actually by bringing in some cases that I document, data fabrication teams to falsify the quality data, to backdate documents, and to essentially create a facade of compliance.
So there's so much we could talk about for hours in this book that I just found incredibly fascinating. But beyond data manipulation, there's
Mhm.
some cleanliness issues in these plants as well. One that
Yeah,
caught my attention was monkey infestations. We don't
yeah.
have monkey infestations in the United States. So there's data problems, and are there cleanliness problems?
Well, there are serious cleanliness problems, and some of them are more serious than others. So, I was documented from records I found, monkeys, bird infestations, snakes. In fact, I have if anybody wants to follow me on my Twitter feed, at Katherine Eban, I have pictures of a snake in one of these sterile plants. Um, but the actually even more serious problem. So a number of these plants in India that I wrote about um, are sterile manufacturing facilities. So they have to follow very strict rules for what's called aseptic manufacturing. These are highly controlled environments, and they're required under good manufacturing practices to test the environment for sterility. They have to test the water, they have to test the air, they have to test the surfaces. Um, in a number of instances, the FDA was able to document that these companies were completely faking their sterility data. Their sterility data was perfect, but in fact, they hadn't sampled anything. They had completely invented the data that was connected to tests that were never performed. So, the consequence for us is for patients that are depending on sterile injectable drugs. I mean, what could be more serious than that? Um, these were drugs from facilities that were never tested for sterility at all.
So the plants aren't clean.
Hmm.
The data is often falsified or
Hmm.
manipulated,
Hmm.
and the investigators come in announced so
Hmm.
that they can be prepared for.
Hmm.
what's the problem here? Is this a culture problem? Is this a finance problem? Is this corruption? Why are they doing this?
Um, that's a great question. So I would say pretty much yes to everything you just said. So first of all, one thing about the generic market, um, I investigated where the incentives lie. So if you have a drug that one day is, let's say, $14 a dose, and the next day it's 4 cents a dose. Okay. And then the plant wants to make a profit, right? And then you have to think about these annoying good manufacturing requirements that require investment in sterility, in operations, in training, right? And what the plants do is they start cutting the bottom out of those standards and slowly eroding the safety, and soon enough finding that actually the best way to do it is you just fake the data entirely. That way you don't have to do any of this annoying stuff, which costs money and time. So part of it is a profit issue. In India, part of it, I do think there is a cultural component, which a number of my, Indian sources talk to me about, which is there is life in India is hard. And there is a Hindi word I learned called jugad, which is essentially the art of the shortcut. Basically, the ability to get to the desired result by the shortest means possible. And that is a navigational skill that is prized in Indian corporate culture. So, it's a way of looking at regulations as obstacles to be gained. So that is prevalent, yes.
So there's all this corporate problem, and Dinesh is now come into the custody of a document that outs all of this,
Mm-hmm.
that he's trying to get into the hands of the right people.
Mm-hmm.
And while this is happening, you're writing some articles about bad drugs.
Mm-hmm.
You published a few in Fortune and elsewhere. And then you meet this guy from Cleveland Clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to bring Dr. Lever up on the screen right
Wonderful.
now.
Great.
Okay, Harry. And oops, and here he comes. And we're going to kind of move people around here. Actually, I'm going to go this way. Okay. So you meet Harry Lever. So, Harry, can you tell us a little bit about what was going on with patients that you saw that made you want to speak to Katherine? Oh, hold on. Now your mic's back on. I'm sorry. Start again.
All right. This all got started when I was listening to a radio program on NPR about food and drugs from China, and um, I couldn't believe what I heard on the program, and that they were drying tea leaves in China by driving trucks over them, and the quality of things coming from there was very poor, and uh, I couldn't believe what I had heard on the program, and I was driving to work that day, and I pulled the program up on Googled it, and read the whole thing, and it was just mind-boggling. So I started doing Google searches, and I started finding drugs. I looked up drugs China, and I found a lot of stuff coming from there, including heparin, and that led to a whole other, the heparin. It turned out the Chinese had contaminated with a drug called supersulfated chondroitin sulfate because they had a shortage of pigs in India, and heparin comes from the small intestine of a pig. So they thought they could put this stuff in, mix it into the heparin, and well, because it would act like an anticoagulant, but it turned out that it caused some very bad reactions in some people, and we finally learned about 200 people died. But at that time, I started noticing in some of my patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the abnormal thickening of the heart, that suddenly the metoprolol succinate I was using, they weren't doing as well on it as they used to. And I started asking them, well, let me see I started wondering what's going on here, what's different. And I started to notice that some of them were coming in with generic preparations that I had never heard about before. And one of them was actually was made in this country. Called a company was called Ethics, and when we investigated, got the package insert, it said on the package insert, does not meet USP specifications for dissolution.
Okay, so make that English for people who
That
don't know what dissolution rates are.
there are certain standards how drugs are supposed to dissolve, and they didn't meet those standards, yet they were allowed to sell the drug. So I got on the phone to the FDA with a pharmacist in my office, and we asked some questions to which they couldn't give me any answers. How are they allowed to sell this drug and it wasn't dissolving properly? And then we found another one coming from India by a company called Walkart. And it turned out when I started looking into things, they had 26% of the market in this country. And clearly the patients weren't doing well. The heart rate wasn't controlled, blood pressure wasn't controlled. They were getting short of breath, having chest pain. I said, there's something wrong here. Mm-hmm. So what I started doing was I had no way of testing the drugs. So what I thought I would do is I will get the name brand, we'll give the patient the same dose of what they were taking generically and see what happens. Well, people started feeling better when we did that. And I couldn't believe. So I wrote a letter to the FDA, told them I was worried about it. I got an email back in 3 hours. They said they'd look into it. And 18 months later, I got a letter, there's no problem.
I'm going to pause you there for a second. Mm-hmm. And my purpose in doing the interview in this manner for those who are watching, this is a book written and researched by Katherine, and it's excellent. But there are real people behind the story. And today, during this interview, you're meeting these people, and hopefully in another interview, you're going to meet some more of them. But I'm going to bring in one of the patients who's mentioned in the book. She's an HCMA warrior. Her name is Kristine Jones, and she's coming up to the screen right now. And 3, 2, 1. And we're in the Brady Bunch boxes here. So I'm going to unmute you, Kristine. So Kristine, you're a patient of Dr. Lever's. Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, I wasn't as astute as you to pay attention to when I switched to a generic from a name brand, and I was taking Corig, which is also a beta blocker, but I got switched to a generic, which was, 50 times cheaper, named Carvedilol, made by a company named Zydus. Never thought anything about it, but had developed some more severe symptoms than what I was experiencing on the Corig, and had a lot of shortness of breath, a lot of irregular heartbeats, and I couldn't figure it out. So after multiple trips to the emergency room, trying to figure out what had happened, I flew out to Cleveland to see Dr. Lever, and I wasn't in his office more than 5 minutes. Then he asked to see my pill bottles, and the minute he saw that one, he says, aha. And I felt so foolish because I had never, correlated the two things. But as soon as I switched back to the brand names, Corig, it's made by GlaxoSmithKline, everything went away and I was back to my regular HCM symptoms.
So, Harry, is this a common theme among some of your patients who aren't feeling so well?
It's more common. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but enough that when I see a patient coming in to see me and they're not doing well, the first thing I'm now saying is, let me see your medicine. And many times that's the problem. And,
okay. To not crowd the audio here, I'm going to bring Kristine back. Thank you for sharing the story with us, Kristine, and you're back into the hide mode. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. We got to get everybody dizzy for a moment. So, Harry, you're hearing stories like this. You're talking to Katherine. Katherine, what are you seeing when you take these two, the clinical picture of what Harry's dealing with on the front end and what you know is going on in the factories of what Dinesh has shared with you?
Right. So, first of all, as I was trying to piece this together, here is somebody like Dr. Lever who is kind of trying to diagnose the drug supply in addition to diagnosing his patients. He's a very remarkably astute clinician. He had kind of a sense that there was problems with certain drugs. He was putting that together And what I was trying to do was, assemble my own global jigsaw puzzle. What were doctors experiencing? What were FDA investigators seeing in these plants? What was happening in the boardrooms, the C-suites of these companies? And what were these executives deciding? And what were FDA officials doing about the information they were getting? And so it was a sort of giant, the book took me 10 years to write. So it was a giant connect the dots project, but there's no question, Dr. Lever in our dialogue, and he very graciously put me in touch with his patients, including Kristine. That allowed me to kind of understand much more vividly and write in the book what the impact of these decisions being made in these distant manufacturing plants, what the impact was on real patients here.
Keep muting myself to clean the audio up, and I forget. Sorry. So we have this cause and effect. We have bad manufacturing practices, deceptive practices, and now we have patients who aren't feeling well. There's a cost to society for this. We buy cheap drugs, but then we end up hospitalized and experiencing more bills and worse health. What did the FDA do to try to protect the American citizens?
Well, one of the things that my book exposes is that, FDA investigators, the FDA ran at the urging of one of its officials, the FDA ran a pilot program in India where they said, okay, what we're going to do, we're going to stop with the pre-announced inspections and having the plants arrange travel for our investigators, or we're going to do a pilot program of totally unannounced inspections. And once they did that, their investigators got the true picture of what was going on in these plants, and some of it was incredibly scary. So their investigators were recommending very serious sanctions on some of these plants. But remarkably, as I was able to connect, the FDA was downgrading those recommended sanctions. And the effect of that was that it let these plants off the hook. It allowed them to continue shipping potentially adulterated drugs from plants with demonstrated quality problems. Now, you might ask, why would they do that? Right? Why would they do that? Well, one of the things that I was able to figure out is that, there's immense political pressure for low-cost medication and to keep a supply of low-cost medication coming into this country. So as soon as you start imposing restrictions on these plants and requiring them to investigate their own quality and essentially taking them offline, right? Then you reduce the flow of low-cost medicine. So, the FDA is basically telling Congress, we got it covered. We're approving generics right and left. We're keeping the flow of these drugs coming to the American public. But at the same time, the question is, what's the cost? What's the actual cost? And I have contended, and I think from my discussions with Dr. Lever, he does too, that there is a hidden cost to these cheap drugs. One of the things that I document at the Cleveland Clinic is patients who were getting switched to a substandard immunosuppressant, transplant patients who were winding up back in the ICU. And in one case, a patient died. They were switched to low quality tacrolimus.
I'm going to pause you on that one because I have some bottles of pills here with me. And I want to share a second story of me and generic drugs. So as many people know, I'm a heart transplant patient. and I take Cleanliness, the drug that was brought up in the book and was problematic by certain manufacturers. And when I transplanted, Dr. Lever told me, don't you ever take this brand or that brand. You always stay on these other brands, because they had had some experience. So for my entire transplant journey of about 3 years, I had been taking the manufacturer Accord. And I take 1.5 milligrams a day in the morning and 1 milligram at night. And you can check your levels of tacrolimus. And I have been consistently a 7, 7.2, 7.4, but around a 7. And that is therapeutic. They want you over 5, under 10, and you find your sweet spot. And mine was 7. And I stayed there. My health insurance company moved my specialty pharmacy to a new company. And I said, I will never take this brand or that brand. They sent me that other brand that I said I'd never take. I said, I'm not taking this because I know it's dangerous. And I sent it back. Actually, they wouldn't let me send it back. Then they sent me Sandoz brand. I had been taking Ascend. Now, when I took the Sandoz brand, now I'm a Jersey girl, and Sandoz used to be right down the street in East Hanover, New Jersey. So I know the name. I knew people that worked there back in the day, thought it was a trusted brand, didn't realize they were manufacturing out of this exact region in India that is problematic. So I waited 3 weeks and I went to go get my blood checked to make sure that I was still around a 7. For the first time in 3 years post-transplant, I was below therapeutic levels with a 4.8, which means I was at risk of organ rejection. It could have killed me. Had I not known this information and gone to get a blood test, I would still be I'd be on 90 days of that manufacturer. And how much damage could have been done in that 90 days is frightening.
Right.
So,
let me say something about that, which is, it is so important for patients to understand this. And, one of the things, so on my website, I have a guide to investigating your own drugs. And so it's on katherineeban.com. But the first step is to know who's making the drugs you're taking. You've got to check, because if it's working, you want to stay on it. You don't want to be switched. And if it's not working, you want to get off it. Because, not everybody has a clinician like Dr. Lever who really understands this and who is able to catch this, So it's important for patients to know this.
It is critically important. And we're getting a lot of questions. I guess somebody's referring to another book about Rambaxi, The Dark Side, that they were trying to get.
Oh, that is the Indian edition of my book.
Oh,
it's the same book. It's just brought out in the Indian market. So I would say to American patients, much easier to order Bottle of Lies with the little blue pills on the cover. Because then it won't, yes, that one. So then it won't be shipped to you from New Delhi, which is going to take a lot longer to get.
Okay, so I'm glad I asked that question.
Okay.
So, Mary, you can get the book. And I have put the link in the introduction to this broadcast. So you can either get the book from HarperCollins, or I like audiobooks these days. I get a lot of multitasking done. You read, you pick up certain things, you listen, you get other things, and Katherine will read the book to you, which is lovely. And she pronounces lots of complicated names very well. I'm very impressed.
Thank you. Not easy to do.
Yeah. So now we're in COVID-19 day. And you just published an article like 4 hours ago. This is not over.
No.
This problem, we haven't solved this. We've uncovered it. What's happening today?
Well, unfortunately, what is happening today is really not good. So, our dependence on India and China as sources for our pharmaceuticals is really harming us right this minute, because drugs are in extremely short supply. With this drive to get a drug like hydroxychloroquine, which the president has spoken so much about, which I should say is not proven to work as a treatment to COVID-19. As a result, the FDA is scrambling to source these drugs from all over the world, and they're dropping their standards further. So at the moment, they are some of these companies that have been in significant trouble with the FDA are essentially getting get out of jail free cards right now from the FDA. They're lifting restrictions on plants that they caught red-handed cheating and faking data, and they're permitting them, not only permitting them, begging them to make drugs for the US market and put these drugs in the strategic national stockpile. But the result of that is that we are going to get more drugs from plants that the FDA knows are not following good manufacturing practices. That is the reality of what is happening right now.
So I'm going to ask a scary question that I know the answer to. And actually, there's two questions. Number one, what percentage of pharmaceutical drugs that come from India and China are inspected by the federal government when they come to this land?
Okay, so under FDA rules, as it has been, the FDA inspects every plant that makes drugs or drug ingredients for the US market. However, the story I published today on Reuters describes a donation of hydroxychloroquine that the FDA accepted from a plant in Pakistan it's never set foot in, a plant in India it's never set foot in, and from an Indian company that it knew that it had previously caught faking data. So, that's, and it's doing this under what's called an emergency use authorization. So basically that says, we're in an emergency situation, we can approve whatever drugs we want.
And they're not tested.
Well, in the case of in the case of the drugs that came in from the plants that had never been inspected, those drugs were tested. But there's a problem with that, which is, you can, if you have millions of tablets, you can do some sample testing. But, it is generally the belief of experts that spot testing, while a good thing, does not substitute for an inspection of a plant and certifying that it's operating with appropriate controls.
So one thing I probably should have gone through earlier, but we'll handle it now. Generic drugs and name brand drugs, they don't have to be 100% equivalent, do they?
No. In fact, there is a much wider range than people would imagine. So under the FDA standards, a generic can be, I think it's 25% above or 20% below the absorption into the blood of the brand name drug. And then they impose a statistical formula to try to bring those results closer to the middle. But the end result is that there can be quite a difference. I mean, if you're switched from one generic to another, you can be in a pretty wide range from one day to the next. And that is why, doctors like Harry, who's a cardiologist where, works with drugs where precise dosing is very important, their patients are sort of the canaries in the coal mine for this wide variance.
Harry, what do you think about the variation and the fact that somebody could be on something that's 85% of the drug or 125%? That's a big gap. Oh, hold on. I'm sorry. I've muted you again. You're back. I'm sorry.
For the kind of patients that I see, that's a big problem. And, there are other drugs may not be quite as critical, but for when you're dealing with heart disease and hypertension and things like that, you want them fairly close. Because, I've seen patients come in, suddenly their blood pressure is not under control. They were doing fine, and all of a sudden, blood pressure is not under control. And we see what they're taking, and find out that the pharmacy changed the manufacturer. And I don't know about it. They don't tell me. They just change it on their own. They think they can. That's something
It's
that have to be changed, because we are the ones responsible for the patient. And if they develop severe hypertension and then have a stroke, well, that doesn't look too good for me. And I didn't know that they changed it.
So we will definitely be adding the links to Katherine's website onto the HCMA website, and we'll disseminate that through social media as well. But what can patients do to take some control over this? How do they get the better drugs, and how do they not get the bad drugs?
So this is not at all simple. You know, I wish I could tell you that this is, oh, here's what you have to do, ABC. But I guess I would urge any of your listeners who to go to my website and look for the guide to investigating your own drugs, because there are things you can do, from identifying the manufacturer, requesting that specific manufacturer if the drug seems to be working, or also looking for what are called authorized generics. So those are, a lot of patients don't know those exist. But so when a drug goes off patent, some of the brand companies like to continue making the drug, but they'll make it under a different label. And that label is called that can be an authorized generic. So there's actually a site where you can search for authorized generics. And they're kind of, they're a good bargain, because you're getting the brand name drug often at the generic price. So that's another option as well. So there are some things that patients can do.
And Harry, can patients request that you write their prescriptions a particular way?
Well, I tend to write when I'm writing generically, I write for the manufacturers that I want. And I also tell my patients, when you go to the pharmacy, don't walk out until you see what they gave you. They won't
to disclose a label here. And I'm going to show you two different kinds, because this is the actual bottle of the manufacturer that they put a prescription bottle on. So that's my prescription. If you look at the bottom of this, it's right on the fold. It tells you who the manufacturer is. And you have, this is another one where they did it right on the fold because the label's too big. So you really can't see it so well. And you have to dig in and look at that teensy tiny little print there for your manufacturer's name. I was just on the phone with a girlfriend before this interview, and I was explaining to her what we were going to talk about. And she went into her cabinets and said, "Where do I find this?"
Yeah.
It's right down there in the little corner, and you might need a magnifying glass to read it, because you really don't want to bring it to your attention.
Yes. Yes. So, most patients don't realize that the manufacturer name is on the label.
Can you give your website is just KatherineEban.com?
Right. And then under Bottle of Lies, there is a tab that says More Info, and that has some FAQs that should be helpful, and a guide to investigating your own drug.
I will definitely be putting that on the HCMA website, maybe by even the end of the day. That's a fantastic resource, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't know it existed until just now.
That's okay.
Okay, so I will open it up to questions. We have Katherine for another about 10 minutes here. While we're getting those questions, you can type them in the Q&A line, and we'll bring them up online as soon as we can. I did have a couple of questions that were given to me in advance that we've kind of hit on, which is, how do I get access to better drugs, and how do I know where my drugs are made? We've addressed those. But as you research the book, and I'm sorry, my tacrolimus just fell. But as you were going through the book, we leave Ranbaxy, and then we start talking about other problems with other manufacturers like Mylan, which is an American-based company that is manufacturing a great deal overseas right now. And we start talking about the problem that most of our active ingredients are coming from China.
Yes.
What do we have to do? What do you think we should be doing as patients to advocate for ourselves to make sure we get better drugs?
You know, this pandemic has really laid bare the very high risk of our dependence on Indian and Chinese drugs and drug ingredients. So, you know, I have contended that we really need a consumer revolution here. Patients need to understand this. They need to contact their elected officials. I believe that we need country of origin labeling for drugs and drug ingredients, because frankly, I think if we did that, you know what would happen? The manufacturers would start bringing manufacturing back to this country. We need to make our own drugs. I mean, that's just a fact. You know, I mean, these are life-saving products. These are not just, you know, I don't know what, all the zillions of things we all buy from China all the time, but this is life and death. So, yeah.
This isn't a magic marker. This
Right.
isn't something to hang on your wall. You're ingesting this.
Right.
And
right.
Harry and I did an interview a couple of weeks ago where we did a PowerPoint, and he showed the picture of the snake and the pig intestines and the bird droppings. Unfortunately, there were no infestation of monkey pictures. I would have been curious to see the infestation of monkey pictures.
Those are on my Twitter feed.
There was one monkey.
Okay, there was one monkey.
Oh, one monkey. Okay.
So this is really regulatory and legislative. We need to encourage our lawmakers to encourage drug manufacturers to come back to the United States so that we can keep a closer eye on the manufacturing process.
Right. You know, but the other thing is, there is this, the way our system is structured. If the FDA tests and approves something, then all the way downstream from that, everybody assumes it's safe. So nobody tests it after that. And the FDA doesn't even test it. They just bless it, and then it's all good, is the assumption. But why, for example, doesn't CVS or Duane Reade or Walgreens, why don't they test the drugs they dispense? Why don't the insurance companies require testing of these drugs? You know, there's so much more that so many of the players in our distribution chain could do to ensure the quality of these drugs, and that none of that is happening right now.
That's an excellent point that I hadn't really thought of, as bringing the other stakeholders to the table and letting them take some of the responsibility, because I had to go to get another blood test, which cost my insurance company money, which cost me money, because my insurance company thought they were saving money by buying a cheaper drug and sending it to me, when in fact it ended up probably costing them the same or more and putting me at risk. Right. I don't think that's their intention. I hope that's not their intention.
No, that's not their intention. But here's part of the problem, which is there are no really good studies of what the hidden costs are of these generic drugs. So let's say there were actual studies done and insurance companies could look at that and understand that. I mean, until there is a documented cost that people can understand, it's hard to create change. So there is really, and I'm sure Harry has a thought about this, but there's a lack of comprehensive studies about this problem.
And one of the challenges that I see to that study being able to be completed is some of the costs are very difficult to quantify. Specifically within the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy community, if somebody like Kristine wasn't feeling well and missed a couple of days of work because she wasn't up to her normal capacity, that's a hard number to quantify in terms of cost to society. And if she didn't go to the hospital and incur a bill, there is a harder way, you know, that we don't really have any numbers in terms of what is the cost to society from the use of healthcare services. So there's a dollar and cents cost, and then there's a quality of life cost. And they're both important, but we might be able to work with some of our research partners to at least do a sample study within the HCM population, or maybe some of the transplant folks as well. You know, my cost was the cost of that extra blood test that I wouldn't have had to have had if I'd been on my same manufacturer. It's little, unless of course I didn't do it and I ended up in intensive care.
Right. I mean, the cost of readmission to an ICU is huge. the cost of organ failure, you know, the cost of a successful heart transplant that suddenly goes bad because a patient is switched to a drug that doesn't work.
We have a question coming in from Al. I'm going to pop it up on the screen.
Okay.
Should pharmacies be required to notify the prescribing doctor, or I will add, or the patient, of a change in manufacturer when refills are required? It's a good question.
It's a fantastic question. In my view, and I'd love to hear what Harry thinks, yes, 100%. Doctors should have that information.
It needs to happen. They should not be allowed to change without me knowing about it. And you know, and you find that they're changing manufacturers by the week sometimes, depending on which price they get better. And all it comes down to how much money it costs. Well, you know, as we've been saying, it costs money if you don't feel well and have to get more things. And you know, it does make a difference. And you know, most people haven't been aware of that, but it's a fact.
I'm going to bring Kristine back up into the room. We're going to get a little busy here for a second. And there we go. Kristine, you're back with us. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm going to wrap up here in a moment because Katherine has something to get off to in about 3 minutes. So I'm going to let her keep her timeline there. Kristine, what have you learned about generic drugs, and what have you learned about advocating for yourself through this process that you've been through?
I definitely learned that you need to speak up and you need to pay attention to when they make any changes with anything in your medications. You know, we spend a lot of money and time in emergency rooms, made our trip to Cleveland and all things. And if I had just used my head and thought about it, I would have put 2 and 2 together.
That's an excellent point. Harry, any parting thoughts for our listeners?
No, I just think I'm hoping that this terrible mess that we're in now is going to wake up more people so that we can get this finally fixed, because it's very real.
I agree. Katherine, any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, to Kristine, and hi, Kristine, it's been so nice to see you there. Hi. We've never actually met face to face, so here we are.
Yep.
But, you know, I would say, really, there's no reason why you should have thought to check, because the FDA has told us all that the drugs are equivalent, right? They have reassured us all that there is no difference between an approved brand and a generic approved for the same use, and that all of the generics are interchangeable. And that is why patients don't look at who the manufacturer is, because the FDA has given all of us this blanket assurance. To me, that is really the kind of fundamental origin of the problem. You know, now that we know it, yes, patients should be checking, but no reason to blame yourself for not having done that, you know, given that you got an assurance from the FDA that the drugs are absolutely interchangeable.
Right. And when I tried to contact them to let them know this, because after I realized the switch and then I improved, I wanted to know, I contacted them 3 different ways and I never heard back.
Right.
So we probably need to be more specific as patients in our follow through, and I'll make sure to add a link to the HCMA website of how to report drug interactions. We do this with devices. You know, we're very clear on how to put in your own MAUD report for the MAUD database on device reliability. We probably should put that up on our website as well to make it easier to report to the FDA that there's a problem. I reported to Sandoz, and I was less than happy with them that they will not take my complaint any further until I give them authorization to speak to my doctor. And I said, yeah, I'm not giving you access to my medical records. If you'd like to hear something, ask me. I will get you the information. So I'm still working my way through Sandoz, and hopefully they'll reach out and they'll be a little bit more helpful in figuring out why with one prescription from them, I went to Beyond Therapeutic and it threatened my life. So we need to work on this. I thank you all so much for joining us today. This has been incredibly informative, insightful, and inspirational. Katherine, thank you for the 10 years that you gave to patients to help us understand this and uncover this treacherous problem. And hopefully together we can work to make it better. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And thank you all for joining us, and
Thank you.
a line on our HCMA website, and you'll see more informational videos being presented over the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.